Okay. So, Ellen, community banks perform a really important function, and when we're talking about public banks, that in no way excludes that industry. And yet, we know that community banks are struggling in the current regulatory environment, and that also local people are struggling trying to get money for projects that everybody needs, like funding for small businesses and so forth. How does the Bank of North Dakota provide services? You said that they work through community banks. What are some of the programs that they do that might be unique to North Dakota banks?
Well, they have a public mandate, and they have certain programs that they support. So for North Dakota, it's farming and energy and students. They had I think the first student loan program in the country, and they still have an excellent student loan program. Mm-hmm. Last time I looked, it was something like 1.7% interest variable. Mm-hmm. So they have these different things that they support, and that you could probably supplement that.
Well, right. I think that's a very big deal. You can be you don't have to have studied in North Dakota, but if you were a student and you've got a high thing, they will rewrite that loan. Yeah, and 5% I think fixed, but pretty.
But I mean, there are other programs.
I see. Okay, sure. Well, I know small businesses, for example. They have a special line of credit available for small business people who are a very large majority of the new employers in America, and of course, the American ingenuity and innovation, all the energy that the American citizenry has bound up, is waiting for the money to be able to create something new. And the Public Bank of North Dakota has a program for that. So we know you, Mr. Jones, and the community banker would be the person who says, look, you want to start a new business? I've known you for years. Your paper looks good. Your business plan is sensible. I don't really take on the kind of risk that your new business would. I'm as a community banker, I don't really take on that kind of risk. But because of the Bank of North Dakota, I can offer you a line of credit based on who I know you are and what your business plan is that will give you up to $50,000 for 5 years at 1% interest. Now, that's a huge step in the direction of invigorating the local economy. Because right now, Americans in every other state have to rely on borrowing from their friends, or they're taking out of their savings, or going to their credit card, which of course the big banks have set at nice price ranges from 18, 15 to 30% interest, which is not the great way to finance an economy. I mean,
agreed.
Yeah. So it's a new animal, isn't it? And we've touched on how it came to be, but one of the aspects of that I think is kind of interesting historically that you've talked about is that it started in 1919, and the dynamics in the economy locally then were very similar to the ones we've got now, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, the farmers were losing their farms to the Wall Street banks, or one particular Wall Street bank, because it was the Rockefeller Bank. The Rockefeller Bank was connected to the Rockefeller Railroad, which is connected to a Rockefeller granary. So it was all one big cartel. And when the farmers realized that they were they were actually losing their farms unfairly. The granary was not taking their grain, although it was good grain. So there was an obvious intent to get their farms. Mm-hmm. And when they realized that, they banded together, formed what was called the Nonpartisan League, neither left nor right. It was not about politics. It was about sovereignty, state sovereignty. They wanted to get their money back in their state to be used for their own purposes. And when you understand how banking works, banks actually create money. So this power to leverage their funds into more credit for the state, that's what they wanted to get back, and that's what they got. And they had a very fiery leader it was that whole populist movement. It was still part of the 1890s populist movement. Uh-huh. And the people got together and had picnics and meetings and educated each other and so forth.
And the similarity to today, it's kind of striking to me, because the same players are executing the same sort of an agenda around controlling commodities, monopolizing markets, limiting credit, and using really money for their own interests as opposed to investing in public interest. So when we talk about public banking, we're actually talking about banking in the public interest. Some people think that's a an unheard of idea. But, you know, again, in fairness to, and with respect and acknowledgement of community banks, credit unions, savings and loans, these are community institutions that really nurture and understand and know the local markets. So in the public banking movement, they're pretty critical, right?
Yeah, they're critical, and today they're not being able to perform that service of servicing the local economy, largely because of Dodd-Frank, which has imposed new regulations that are just crippling the community banks. But in North Dakota, they're doing fine. In fact, the whole state is doing fine. As you mentioned, in November 2014, the Wall Street Journal came out with an article that said that the Bank of North Dakota was more profitable than JP Morgan Chase and Goldman Sachs, among other big Wall Street banks. And why was that? It's because their costs are very low. They don't pay bonuses, fees, commissions. Their highest paid employee is their president, who gets like $240,000 a year, compared to, for example, the president of Wells Fargo gets $20 million, I think, a year. I forget what else.
Yeah. Well, right. They don't have branches. They don't have advertising campaigns.
Right. They don't advertise. They've got a captive deposit base because by law, all of the revenues of the state are deposited in the Bank of North Dakota. So they have this huge amount of money that they can leverage, and they don't have to bid for it, and they're not competing with the local banks. So the whole model is very sustainable. And some people say it's all about oil, but the oil boom did not actually hit until 2010 in North Dakota, and they were already the only state that was in the black in early 2009. They had the lowest unemployment rate in the country, one of the lowest foreclosure rates, lowest credit card debt, etc.
Right.
So,
yeah. Right.
Sorry, lowest default rate on credit cards.
Well, and other neat little factoids, you know, no bank failures for 20 years, and the bank itself, the Bank of North Dakota, generates, through its own simple banking operations, a profit. The last 10 years and more, they've been generating over $30 million a year and more, which goes back into the state treasury. Now, I know where we are in New Jersey, people would love to have that sort of an option where we would be able to use our money and invest in ourselves, as opposed to having to go to Wall Street or outside to borrow at great expense. And that's really what this is all about, is as we discussed in that graphic before, the circular nature of the banking system, taking out the middleman of the Wall Street private interest, allows the money to come back into the economy, which builds the value, and the bank can make really inexpensive loans, building infrastructure, for example. Just say a word or two about infrastructure. I mean, there's an enormous amount of expense that goes to financing of things like bridges, isn't there?
Yeah, 50% of the cost of infrastructure goes to interest and bank fees. So if the state owned its own bank, it could save 50% on infrastructure. Plus, again, you get to control where the credit goes. You don't get stuck with these, say, interest rate swaps that have turned out to be a very bad deal that state and local governments have spent a lot of money trying to get out of. Mm-hmm. I mean, they're just basically scams of Wall Street. These were supposedly interest rate swaps are the largest form of derivative, something like $300 trillion worth of interest rate swaps, 280 something like that.
Who's counting, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a ridiculous fantasy figure, right?
Yeah, and and they were there to, so you're basically betting against Wall Street. You're betting that interest rates will go up, but they don't frame it like that, but that's really what it was. You're betting they'll go up, and Wall Street's betting they'll go down. But Wall Street has the ear of the Federal Reserve, which is actually there to serve Wall Street. I mean, the Federal Reserve is composed of 12 branches, all of which are 100% owned by the banks in their district. The largest and most influential is the New York Federal Reserve, which that means Wall Street. Wall Street basically controls the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve dropped interest rates very, very low to 0.25% for banks at the prime rate. So basically, you're betting against the house, and the house controls the rate.
Well, we're going to cut the conversation here at that point, which is an exciting point. We're going to revisit that in our next conversation together about who's really running the money system, why the American public and the American economy suffers at the effect of it being controlled by a small group of people, and then sort of delve into how this is impacting other aspects of our lives, both personally but also democratically and politically, and what prospects we have now that we know that public banks can be created in our interest. So let me just say a word about these books so that people, so our viewers can check them out. I'm going to hold this up. This is Ellen's first book called Web of Debt, which is the primer really on getting into the historical background of where banking comes from, who's been in charge of it, who's been in control of it along the way. And then her latest book, The Public Bank Solution, name of this program, in which she brings forward the various ways in which the public can reclaim control of its money and to move on with building a new society and a new, more fair and just economic system. Thank you once again for joining us, and Ellen, thank you for joining us today. It's really great to have you with us.
Thank you.
All right.